My name is Gavin Cleespees, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. Our program this evening will look at the just published book, The Nazis of Copley Square. In this book, Professor Gallagher provides a crucial missing chapter in the history of the American far right by looking at the Christian front. The supporters of the Christian front imagine themselves as crusaders fighting for the spiritual purification of the nation under assault from godless communism. The front's anti-Semitism was inspired by Sunday sermons and lay leaders openly espousing fascism and Nazi beliefs. The book is a tale of religion perverted to violent ends and shockingly relevant with the far-right ideologies of today. Our speaker this evening is Professor Charles Gallagher, who teaches at Boston College. Prior to arriving at BC, he was at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations, where he was a visiting fellow. And before that, he taught in the history department at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester. He has published a number of books, including Vatican Secret Diplomacy, Joseph P. Hurley, and Pope Pius XII, which won the John Gilmary Shea Prize from the American Catholic Historical Association. His interests include American Catholicism, papal diplomacy, international relations, the Holocaust, and intelligence history. Before we begin the program, I'd like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be joining an MHS program for the first time. If you're not familiar with the Massachusetts Historical Society, we are the oldest historical society in America and have been collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our history since 1791. We hold an amazing collection of close to 14 million manuscript pages, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents. Because of the support of our donors, we can offer programs like this evening's for free and keep our library open to the public. We hope you'll return to future events, and if you enjoy our program, we hope you'll consider supporting our work by becoming a member. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Gallagher.
My name is Charles Gallagher. I'm in the history department at Boston College, as Gavin said. First, I'd like to thank Olivia Sea, who helped with the tech on this, and also Gavin for inviting me to give this talk about my new book, The Nazis of Copley Square. I think I'd like to start today by talking about this intersection of religion. It's an intersection of religion with, in many ways, paramilitarism and a mangled vision of theology that emerges on the East Coast in the mid to late 1930s. And what I, in my research, uncovered is a rather fascinating story that included not only priests and bishops, but also theologians and spies. All of this centered on a group of Catholics who roamed from Brooklyn to South Boston. And so I want to begin by just creating the story of the Nazis of Copley Square as something that is beginning far, far away from Copley Square. The movement began in Great Britain by and large, and it was the brainchild of a recently converted Catholic. In 1933, Arnold Lunn, who was the son of a Methodist minister, a prominent Methodist minister in Britain, converted to Roman Catholicism. And soon after, he began to write journalistic articles for Catholic periodicals in Britain. And he became concerned about what he viewed as global communism's persecution of Roman Catholicism. And what emerged is something I see and I call ecumenical anti-communism. And basically what Lunn wanted to do was to heal the rift of the Reformation, of the Protestant Reformation, by bringing the Roman Catholic Church and the many Protestant denominations into alignment positioning them as anti-communists, as a great Christian force against anti-communism, and by this kind of breed an ecumenical movement grounded in a shared almost fear of global communism. And so he and his father did that. His father was very active in the Protestant movement, Faith and Order, in the early 20th century. Arnold himself had gone to many ecumenical conferences throughout Europe, particularly in Switzerland, where he enjoyed skiing, and Lund, as well as kind of providing the intellectual basis for this Christian front idea, is also considered by many to be the father of slalom skiing, of all things. He was a champion skier and became a self-styled theologian and a Catholic apologist. And during the mid-1930s, he became fiercely committed to this idea that all Christians could come together and become anti-communists together, grounded in Christ. And his application of a Christian front was the diametric term that the Seventh Communist International had adopted in 1934, where they created the Popular Front movement, whereby communism would ostensibly drop its revolutionary character and try to head towards a more democratic, ostensible position. And so this is what Lund did. He tried to bring Catholics and Protestants together, particularly during the period of the Spanish Civil War. And this idea became grounded in Britain. He and his cohort moved that discussion to Rome and to the halls of the interior of the Vatican, where many prominent Vatican diplomats came to understand it and took it up, including Eugenio Pacelli, the Cardinal Secretary of State, who would go on to be the controversial Pope during World War II. He was alerted to this idea of ecumenical anti-communism grounded in the notion of a Christian front. And by 1938, Pacelli, in a speech in Budapest, more or less endorsed this idea of Lund's and made it public. At the same time, in the United States, we have Father Charles Coughlin, who at that time was probably the most well-known radio personality of the day, or one of them. He had about 30 million listeners on the radio every day. And he took up that cause, and he twisted the idea of Lund's and Pacelli's idea of a Christian front. Coughlin decided that he was going to drop any kind of ecumenical overtones to it, and he inserted a high level of paramilitarism. Basically, Coughlin believed that global communism could not be fought simply at the spiritual level, that there had to be a level of paramilitarism in place in order to stop what he saw as persecutions of Catholics in Spain and in Mexico. And so basically, while Lund's ideas are aggressive, they're not militaristic yet. Coughlin changes all that. Coughlin takes this from Britain to Budapest to Rome. When it lands in the United States and Coughlin gets a hold of the Christian front idea, I argue it's he who paramilitarizes the Christian front. So in the book, what I try to do is, what I've seen is that most historians who look at this and have looked at this topic have viewed it from the position of political history. And I think you miss a great deal if you do that. I believe that these folks are grounded in theological commitments that need to be unwrapped and understood. And only when you unwrap those theological commitments can you understand why they end up paramilitarizing. And so what I see and write about in the book is that these Catholics who Coughlin is talking to are imbued with kind of ordinary concepts of Catholic theology that permeate the zeitgeist of the day for Catholics. And two of those theologies are what are known as mystical body of Christ theology, which is based in St. Paul's reading of scriptures, where all baptized Christians are a part of the body of Christ, mystical body of Christ. And what I see this doing is I see that sort of theology as breaking down national borders and barriers, and creating a theology that gives a connectivity globally to the Catholic population in particular. And so if the Catholic institutions in Spain or in Mexico are being persecuted, that has real impact through mystical body of Christ theology in Boston or in Somerville or in the Bronx for these Catholics. The other piece that's coming into play here is Catholic Action. And Catholic Action was a social uplift movement started by Pope Pius XI in 1922. And it was meant to bring lay people, that's non-ordained Catholics, people who go to church regularly and sit in the pews, to bring them to work with priests and bishops under the guidance of the Pope to do social uplift in the way that they are directed by their particularly priests, bishops, and clerical leaders. So these are all legitimate theologies. They're all well-known theology. They're not well-known today. They've dropped out of the parlance today. Very few people know or understand them today. But they were legitimate at the time during the 1930s and dominant, I would say, during the 1940s. And what I argue in the book is that through the interplay of these two theologies, these aggressive paramilitarized Catholics are going to be able to give moral permission to their taking up of arms against godless communism. So these are the issues I'm looking at in the book. The foremost engine for this moral ability to choose this way is anti-Semitism among Catholics, which sadly, and I say that because I'm an ordained Roman Catholic priest, I'm a member of the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits, the order that founded Boston College where I teach. So up until 1965, anti-Semitism was baked into the theology of Roman Catholicism, both scripturally and in some ways just constitutionally, because of the way of interpretation of the church at that time. And so the anti-Semitism allows them to slide over and to be more influenced by Nazi anti-Semitism, albeit racial anti-Semitism. And then secondly, I think this group is really interesting to look at because it's a movement of ordinary Catholics. It's a movement of working class ordinary Catholics, working class Catholics in New York and Boston. And it's really hard to get documents on the quote unquote lived religion of how these folks were operating at the time. But as I've uncovered, about 5 different intelligence agencies from around the globe were writing notes and taking interviews, many times clandestinely, with members of these organizations, so that you get to feel their real mind. And those documents about, I would say I used largely FBI documents, and I was able to get 3 big files released to the, which were about 4,200 pages altogether of conversations with Christian Front members and reports on them. So it's really interesting. You get this ground level working class Catholic view. And then thirdly, I should say, the context for this anti-Semitism allowing these folks to paramilitarize, I believe, are kind of these 2 concepts. The first is Judeo-Bolshevism, the fact that Catholics believed under Coughlin, Catholics believed, and Coughlin promoted, that communism was a creation of secular Judaism, And in other words, that Marx's Judaism and Jewish connections to the first to the Leninist October Revolution were so dominant that Coughlin makes clear to his flock that communism and Judaism are intertwined, and they were both present at the creation of communism itself. And then secondly, the deicide is the concept of the death of Christ on the cross, and that not the Roman Empire had anything to do with this, but that Jews themselves were the foremost mechanism by which Jesus ended up dying on the cross in the crucifixion. And so these are combinations of deeply held religious beliefs and secular politics. Very interesting move. I mentioned these folks paramilitarized. In 1940, there was a case where the Christian Front was charged with sedition in January of 1940. That's the violent overthrow of the US government. And so they were put on trial in the spring of 1940, and that trial was set in motion. Just some images here of who they are. And this last image here is of them at target practice in Narrowsburg, New York. I think I may have to move this. They're at target practice there. And they're using military grade rifles. They're using Lee Enfield rifles, which they've purchased through the National Rifle Association. At this time, this is something I discovered in my research. At this time, if you were a member of the National Rifle Association, you could, through the US Department of War, send your NRA membership card to them. And if you would like, you could purchase a Lee Enfield breech-loading military standard rifle and have the War Department send it to you in the mail for the princely sum of $7.50. They would send it to the local armory for you to pick up, or the armory could actually mail that with an extra $1.35, mail that to your doorstep. So these folks were actually ordering their military grade weaponry. The Lee Enfield rifle is a really excellent rifle. It's not a semi-automatic. It's a breech loading rifle, but you can get off about 20, 30 rounds per minute with that. And it shoots a 30-06 bullet, which is almost 3 inches long, and it's quite an effective firearm. And again, it's used basically for purposes of war. It was the main battlefield weapon of World War I. So that's how they were caching weapons. You could also buy through the NRA. You could purchase leftover military paraphernalia and some bomb making materials. So this is what's happening to them. This is a headline from the Boston Globe from January of 1940, and it's recounting the arrest. Again, this is something that had always struck me as rather anachronistic to the way I was brought up as a Catholic. The fact that we have these Catholic men trying to overthrow the government, being charged with sedition, and so that always kind of stuck in the back of my mind, that I thought, rather than being an anomaly in the trajectory of American Catholic history, that this story might be able to tell us something more about another side of what's going on in American Catholicism. Sorry about that graphic. This is the leader of that was the New York group was put on trial and shut down in the spring of 1940. The New York group, based mainly in Brooklyn, they were not convicted. That prosecution fizzled for a number of complex reasons, which I get into in the book, mainly because both the prosecution and the state didn't want religion to come into the courtroom. And so consequently, this group that's called the Christian Front that's being charged with sedition, neither the state nor the bar nor the prosecution wanted it to be about religion, and so they ended up having a very good legal advice, I think, and we're able to get that case dissolved, or nolo prost, as they say. The main research question that I had that brought me to this book was, I knew all about the New York front and that case, and I knew that the FBI had shut them down in the spring of 1940. But then as I kind of poked around in the archives, I kept finding that there was this group in Boston that stayed above water and kept alive until 1942. And so my question was, how did that happen? And the first piece of answering that puzzle is that in Boston, there was a very charismatic young Catholic ex-seminarian, a former Franciscan seminarian, who came on the scene and was an excellent organizer, a very charismatic figure, well-versed in public speaking and well-versed in Catholic theology, a very devout practicing Catholic. And he took up the idea of the Christian Front and moved it to Boston. And because of his organizational skills, his charism, and his speaking ability, he kept the group operating to the point where even after the Christian Front case, the sedition case goes on in New York, there are about 30,000 members of the Christian Front in New England by early 1941 due to the work of this man, Francis P. Moran, from South Boston and later from Dorchester. How does Moran keep up and keep going? He's always looking for a helping hand, and he's always looking for financial assistance. He is rebuffed by the Archdiocese of Boston. He tries to get an affiliation with Cardinal O'Connell and the official institutional Church of Boston, but he's rebuffed by the Cardinal and his advisors. And this is a big blow to him. And he doesn't know how he's going to keep going if he doesn't have that institutional support. At the same time, he begins looking for support. The Nazis end up sending, under diplomatic cover, an SS officer to Boston to do work as the consul, undercover work as the consul. Long story short, a Hitler nemesis was living in Boston at the time. Heinrich Brüning was teaching in the political science department at Harvard. Brüning was the last real chancellor, the one that served the longest period before Hitler. And so Brüning had substantial interactions with Hitler and became really an enemy of Hitler's, and was living in Boston. And after Kristallnacht in November of 1938, the night of broken glass against the Jews in Germany, Brüning broke his silence and began making public speeches. And it was at that time that this German consul, who was a very high-ranking SS officer, was sent to Boston in order to put the clamps on Brüning. Everybody thought that no one knew this at the time. The press reported that this man, Herbert Scholz, had made some sort of diplomatic faux pas and was being sent to Boston to be put out to pasture, but he instead was sent to Boston to turn the screws on Brüning and to also set up a number of spy rings. His pedigree is impeccable. He worked both in the Brown House in Munich for Rudolf Hess, who was then deputy Führer. He was recruited from the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, in the late 1920s into the SS personally by Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust. And by 1934, he had risen through the ranks of the SS, the Hitler Black Guard, and had been assigned to foreign policy or to foreign assignments as a diplomat, mainly because of his excellent language skills and his strict ideology. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi ideologically, and well known to Hitler and liked by Himmler. And so he was kind of the American spy master for the Nazis. Interestingly enough, no scholar has before this book has written anything about him. And so I can tell you he was quite energetic in his espionage efforts. And one of those efforts was to recruit Francis Moran into his Christian Front organization to take direction from him as consul. Here is a photograph of him sitting in the consulate in July of 1941. He's reading the newspaper story telling him about his own expulsion from the United States, and that wouldn't keep him down. Himmler immediately sent him, after he was expelled in July of 1941, Himmler sent him to Budapest, where Admiral Horthy, who was the regent of Hungary, was getting somewhat ambiguous about his stance on Jewish deportations. And so you can see how much of a heavy he was. They sent Scholz to kind of, again, turn the screws on Horthy. And then by the end of the war, he ends up in Italy as the aide-de-camp to the highest ranking Waffen-SS officer, Karl Wolff. This is the consulate, the German consulate in Beacon Hill. That's about 2 blocks from the State House. That's in the spring of 1940. That flag was put out after Hitler's birthday of that year, and as far as we can tell, flew in that way until Scholz was expelled. It's quite a chilling image, frankly. So then, what happens here? Moran moves from strength to strength during the summer of 1940 and into the fall of 1941. Membership ticks upward, his speeches increase, his pro-Nazism in his public events increases, and he becomes quite widely covered in the press in New England and nationally, but no one can kind of pin down why his ascendancy is so quick and that his pro-Nazism is so vocal, except for British intelligence, which is operating out of an office called British Passport Control in New York City, located in the Rockefeller building. And British intelligence, MI6, otherwise known as British Security Corporation, coordination, I should say, British Security Coordination. They are monitoring a lot of the radio broadcasting coming out of the U.S. and they pick up a radio program in the summer of 1940, made by a Jesuit priest connected to Boston College, which he gives an hour-long broadcast. This is Reverend Michael J. Ahern, who was known regionally, kind of like he had the same kind of radio show as Father Coughlin, and he was as well listened to as Father Coughlin in a regional way. And he gave an hour speech about how Catholics on the East Coast, because his network went from Maine all the way to Southern Connecticut, how Catholics on the East Coast could morally permit themselves to join the Christian Front. Well, this was a boon to Moran, it was a boon to Nazi intelligence, and it was picked up by British intelligence. And they finally decided that British intelligence themselves decided that they had to do something to step in, because after Ahern's address, the Christian Front membership exploded. And Stevenson and MI6 decided they needed to look into who Moran was, and they created an effort, a clandestine effort, to try to shut down the Christian Front in Boston. And they recruited an agent here in Boston to try to do that. They recruited that agent through a cutout, which I'll talk about shortly. This is a woman who they recruited. They were insistent that they had to create kind of like a neighborhood neighborhood activist organization, and they called it the Irish American Defense Association. And at first, the British had a hard time trying to find someone to take up this job. Frankly, nobody wanted to do it. Anybody who was a Catholic of any prominence and anti-Christian front felt that they didn't want to meet with the pushback that Moran could offer. So they recruited this young woman who was a liberal Catholic activist. She had been influenced by kind of socialist politics in Boston at the time, and she took up the task. And the cutout, now that's a representative of British intelligence who is recruiting this person, in this case Sweeney, to run the organization. That's an American who's actually working for British intelligence. We don't know who they are. It's kind of murky. I have a hunch, but we don't know exactly who they are. But they convinced Sweeney that she should run this new kind of more or less neighborhood organization, activist organization, to take on the Christian front. And because Sweeney believes, and this is decades prior to it becoming official, but to our ears sounds so strange because it's so obvious, that Sweeney believes that anti-Semitism on the part of Catholics is sinful, is an offense against God. And so that's why she takes up this role. And she works unwittingly to run this organization, which is really a front organization of British intelligence. How do we know that? These are some images that other documents from the UK that I was able to get declassified. This is from Special Operations Executive America files. Special Operations Executive, SOE, was a subversive warfare unit that was established by Winston Churchill shortly after World War II started in September of 1939. And when I went and got these files released from the British National Archives, you have Francis Sweeney's signature, original letters from Francis Sweeney on the letterhead, writing to some of her handlers in British intelligence, right there in these secret files. And so I was able to marry documents from declassified secret archives in the UK for British intelligence and documents that were in Boston archives, and marry those documents and find out how this operation was proceeding and moving forward is rather fascinating, kind of jaw-dropping revelations. So this is what the British decided to do. They decided to go around the FBI because what they were doing was entirely illegal. Some say that it's the first time that the British returned to Boston since 1776. But we'll let that go. So they moved in. Oh, and their offices were in the Little Building, right downtown, off of the Public Gardens, one of the most beautiful and residences in Boston. And so they decided to obviate the FBI, who didn't know anything about their work, obviate the White House, and to target the local police commissioner and the attorney general of Massachusetts, to try to push them to suppress the Christian front. And so they did that. They used Sweeney. They orchestrated the Sweeney organization, the Irish American Defense Association, to pressure the Boston Police Department and the Massachusetts Attorney General to take the Christian front seriously, to try to find some criminal reason to get them suppressed and get Moran arrested. What they did was they moved in and they confiscated leaflet propaganda and book propaganda that Moran was selling at his Christian Front meetings at Hibernian Hall. And what had happened was these books that Moran was selling were published by a publishing firm that was supported by Nazi Germany, but the publisher had been recently indicted for violating the Espionage Act, but hadn't been convicted for that. And so the police commissioner, Joseph Timilty, went in, seized all of Moran's books, took them and impounded them, and then decided that he could remove Moran, detain Moran, but not arrest him. because because of the First Amendment protections, he didn't have anything to arrest Moran on. But this was kind of coast to coast news when it happened in January of 1942. This completely upset FBI Director Hoover, who by this time was trying to look more closely at Moran. And with Moran being taken off the scene by the local police, this upset Hoover immensely, because he could no longer treat Moran as and prosecute him for any moves he would make publicly, and it took him off the scene. Finally, what emerged from, I should say before closing, what emerged from that British operation where Moran is detained by the Boston police. So he's publicly put out of commission, and he publicly says he's going to disband the Christian Front. What happens are two things. The Christian Front goes underground and stays active underground in a cell network until 1945, really until the summer of 1945. And the second thing that happens is that once Moran is taken out of the Boston scene, all of his radically anti-Semitized Christian Front members kind of devolve into an atomized gang situation. And in the fall of 1943, you have months of Catholic on Jewish violence, described in the press oftentimes as riots, when it is described in the press, because the Jewish community in Boston didn't want the press to cover a lot of the violence that was going on for reasons I get into in the book. So there are these massive riots in the fall of 1943 that another historian, Stephen Norwood, has written about these. But I would say that while many historians looked at it as a spontaneous set of riots, I would see it as the blowback, the deleterious effect of a well-run British intelligence operation, illegally run on American soil. And so what happens then as well is that a third thing happens. Timilty can't arrest Moran because of First Amendment protections. He hasn't broken any law, but there's another person who's interested, this guy, J. Franklin Carter, who's the personal intelligence chief for President Roosevelt. He's interested in getting Moran arrested. So he writes to Moran's congressman, John W. McCormick, who's the House Majority Leader at the time, telling McCormick that one of his constituents could actually inspire people to assassinate the president. And so there's this heated exchange about basically Carter, working for President Roosevelt, trying to get Francis Moran thrown in jail, arrested and convicted. And so one of my questions was, why is this Carter fellow putting so much energy into trying to get Moran arrested? And what I found was, because since I was 15, I subscribed to this journal called the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. I grew up in Binghamton, New York, and it got kind of boring there. So when you found a journal with this title, that became kind of my monthly excitement. And so one of the articles that was published in 2010 fairly convincingly argues that John Franklin Carter was a member of Russian GRU, that's Soviet military intelligence. And so now you had the British in South Boston, you had the Nazis in South Boston, and now I'm arguing you have shades of the Russians in South Boston as well, all centered on this group. And finally, what happens to Herbert Scholz? Herbert Scholz ends up in Italy. He's arrested by U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps in 1945. He escapes their clutches in 1946 through the good offices of Cardinal Fossati of Turin, who wrote him a very lovely a character reference, and he escapes briefly to Buenos Aires to have a 6-month affair with the former wife of the Italian fashion designer Oleg Cassini. Actually, she was a Nazi sympathizer. They went to Buenos Aires. That lasted for about 6 months until she broke up with him. Then he moved to Bolivia, started investing in copper mines, and then was able to move back to Germany in the late 50s and petitioned the German Republic, Federal Republic, to give him his pension as a German diplomat. And he purchased a villa on the shores of Lake Starnberg, a very affluent address outside of Munich, and lived in a villa until his death in 1985, more or less escaping the clutches of any clear justice. I'll end with this piece that's from a letter written about Frances Sweeney by her fiance. Frances Sweeney died suddenly in 1944 of a heart attack while she was walking down the street. And in this piece, her boyfriend writes, "It just doesn't seem right that one who could see so much evil around her and spared neither time nor courage to fight it was so suddenly taken away. And for those of us who are left behind, her deeds should be a challenge to carry on the good work that she started." A very touching remembrance for Frances Sweeney, indeed, in the context of this emergence of this violent group who used theology, a mangled form of theology, to undertake violence and espionage against their nation. And so with that, I will conclude. And then if Gavin can let me know what he would like me to do next, I'll be happy to do that.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. It's a really fascinating story, and I think a very enlightening look. But there's certainly a few. And I'll try to group a couple that are kind of together, somewhat similar. But David said, beyond their shared anti-Semitism, were there connections between the 1930 Catholic Front and the 1950 Feeneyism?
So, interestingly enough, what this question refers to is a Jesuit priest named Feeney, who by the 1950s was giving anti-Semitic soapbox speeches on Boston Common, Leonard Feeney. And Leonard Feeney also gained national coast-to-coast attention because of this. Leonard, the only connection here is that Leonard Feeney's father was an informant for the FBI on the Christian Front, which is kind of wild because his son, the priest, becomes another Father Coughlin in a way, or a junior Father Coughlin. But in 1940, Feeney's own father is reporting to the FBI in Boston about his experiences at Christian Front meetings, and the FBI develops that lead, and they develop him as kind of a primary informant. And so it's unclear whether Feeney, the anti-Semitic priest, ever knew that his father was an informant for the FBI that shut down the Christian Front in New York and tried its best, haltingly, to work against the Christian Front in Boston.
It's amazing the connections that we find. History gives you a little bit of a better perspective, I guess. So two people, Dr. Estrella Luna and Diane, ask, what happened to Moran?
Yeah, so what happened to Moran is that by 1946, he had to cede the public control of the front to a priest no one's ever heard of, a New York priest named Edward Lodge Curran. And really between 1944 and 1946, this Father Curran, who was a New York priest, would make trips to Boston, and he became the public face of the Christian Front. And what happened there is that Moran fell out of notice. Also, the FBI was able to put an informant inside the cell structure of the Christian Front and monitor Moran that way, and that led to him kind of becoming more tempered in his public statements. So he kind of retires to private citizenship. He tries to get jobs in various factories and businesses, but no one will hire him. By 1947, he's driving a cab in South Boston. And by the 1950s, he's become, in fact, a reference librarian, in fact, a very high-level reference librarian at the Boston Public Library. He was a very bookish guy. He considered himself a working class intellectual. And so he runs the reference and the circulation desk for a time at the Boston Public Library until his death in the early 70s.
Wow. Yeah. Go figure. That actually does somewhat connect to two other questions that came in. Ron and an anonymous attendee essentially both ask about the Copley Square reference in the title.
Yeah, so I should have been more forthright about that. The Christian Front headquarters was a suite in the Copley Square Hotel. And that's where he had his headquarters. And in fact, I know the room number exactly. I'm not going to give it out, but it's, you know, in essence, kind of bought and paid for by the Nazis. And the Copley Square Hotel at the time was you know, it still is today, a kind of a revered hotel. But back in the day, it's where I think Babe Ruth lived there when he was playing for the Red Sox. It has a beautiful architecture and right in Copley Square, and that's where the headquarters were for the Christian Front.
Okay. Joe wrote, "Thank you for their talk. Are there any broad lessons you draw from your study of the Christian Front about the ties between politics and religion, and between Catholicism and politics more broadly?" It's a broad question.
Yeah, it is a broad question, but I think it's a good question. I think what it says to me is that, and not just in reference to Catholicism, but in reference to religion, that the folks on the fringe need to be taken seriously in a way. The Christian Front expanded in the US because no one took them seriously. And they were able to paramilitarize and engage and plan terroristic activity. This is the contribution of the book. For 75 years, most historians thought these people were crackpots. When I got the FBI file released, it was 2,500 pages long. And what they were doing was chilling. I mean, what they were doing was jaw-droppingly chilling. And I put that in the book. And so they were dismissed from top to bottom in their own church and from outsiders looking in as crackpots, as fringe crazies who would never amount to anything. What this book shows is that if you keep dismissing them and not, I'm not saying we need to try to understand them in a way that would glorify them, but we need to figure out who they are and what their grievance claims are, because it's those grievance claims that can lead to real serious ramifications and allow them to metastasize in society and do harm both to people and to our democracy, I think.
Great, thank you. Philomena asked, how did the church hierarchy in general respond to this Christian nationalism? You said until 1965, anti-Semitism was, quote, baked into Catholic theology. Was this also commonly held among priests, lay people, etc.? Was there much pushback against anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so if you get a chance to read the book, you will see how deeply pervasive and deeply grotesque the anti-Semitism was among many Catholics during the period. This issue of the deicide permeated Catholic scriptural exegesis, meaning how Catholics read the Bible and had it interpreted. It also was a part of mass, like sermons and Good Friday, the perfidious Jews. This is a period before the reforms, and so Jews were viewed not only as other and distant, but as inimical to Roman Catholicism, and as those who were the ultimate mechanism for placing Christ in his passion on the cross. And so this was deeply held. There is interestingly enough, John Connolly, the historian, wrote a book in about 10 years ago now called From Enemy to Brother, where he examines the ecumenical movement and how there was this movement away from this pernicious anti-Semitism. The case he leaves out, because it's centered a lot in America, the case he leaves out is the Christian Front case. And so too, there was another book written on the history of Catholics and the FBI. The other case that's left out is that book leaves out the Christian Front. And so yes, unfortunately, this is the sad case, but also it's a warning. I mean, I think I've written this book as a warning about how deeply grotesque these principles can become if they're not viewed in a way that will lead to change.
Thank you. So Ed asked, was there any relationship between the Christian Front and the American First Lindbergh movement?
Well, yeah, it's an obvious connection to make. The answer to that is no connective tissue between the America First organization and no connective tissue between the IRA either. That's a common question people have. The reason for that is because Father Coughlin is a megalomaniac, and his movement is all about himself. And he is going to be the inspirational kind of headmaster of this organization. And so he doesn't allow any interlopers to move in on his turf. This Christian Front situation is his own inspiration.
There's a question that said, are church authorities displeased with your revelations about the church's role during this period? I think that's kind of, obviously you are a member of the church.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So there are a couple elements to that. I was trained as a historian before I became a priest. So I was trained, I did my PhD way before I ever entered religious life. So I was trained in a way to be a secular historian, judicious, objective, or at least trying to be as objective as one possibly can. But the second thing that I'd like people to know about this book is that this book is not about the institutional church. It's about rogue Catholic priests. It's about rogue lay Catholics. It's about Catholics who were numerous and were a wedge within the church that didn't have the official approval of the institution itself, of popes, of bishops. Now, there were bishops, certainly bishops that sympathized with the Christian Front, particularly in New York. In fact, you had Christian Front bishops, but as an interesting thing is, this is not about the hierarchy that we know. It is about kind of ordinary Catholics, and it's about rogue priests who inform them, and it's about rogue bishops. It's a very and that might be upsetting to the hierarchy to hear. But the thing is, this is why I think the story is important. That just to know that these movements can happen.
So I think that we probably just have time for one last question.
Okay.
And just sort of on your statement about why it's important, Dr. Estrella Luna also asked, why do you think this history was forgotten or buried?
So the Catholics wanted to shove it under the rug because from about 1860 to 1940, the whole impulse within American Catholicism was to prove their patriotism. And so when you have a group of Catholics charged with trying to overthrow the government, that becomes something very serious to the official church. The other interesting point is the way which the national security apparatus worked with the church hierarchy and worked with the judicial system to try to see that play out. And so it's a story of kind of Catholic triumphalism. It's a story of kind of a hand-in-hand situation between how the FBI is going to deal with this group and how the FBI is going to interact with the higher echelons of Roman Catholicism. And the FBI didn't want to, and President Roosevelt also didn't want to lose the Catholic vote. And so there's that too going on. So how far was the Roosevelt administration going to prosecute these folks? Well, it was a tricky dance, you know.
Yeah, well, I think politics is unfortunately often a tricky dance, including today. Well, thank you very much. I think this was a really fascinating conversation, and it's a wonderful book. I realized that we had over 30 questions, so we only got to a fraction of those. We will pass those on to you after the program. But I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you very much for this great presentation. And before we sign off, I just want to let everyone know that this book is available for sale, and we hope that people will purchase a copy of it. It really is a gripping read, so I highly encourage people to buy a copy. And so I hope everyone enjoyed the program, and I hope you go on to have a great weekend. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Olivia. Bye-bye.